Chapter 24. The Battle. Oh, was you ever in Mobile Bay? Lowlands, lowlands away, my John, a screwing cotton by the day, my $1.50 a day. Capstan Shanty. Muerte al gringos! Bert shuddered at the shrill cry that rose above the hoarse roar of the attackers and was tossed back and forth like a shuttlecock. Held by the terrible fascination of the battle scene before him, Bert was scarcely aware that others, armed like himself with clubs, waited by his right side. Behind him he heard the grating of keys in little-used locks as the helmsman locked himself in the wheelhouse. In his few brief moments of inactivity, the boy trembled at the awful truth that soon he would have to rush forward and kill or be killed. This was war. Above the surging mass of the attackers, where the port bulwarks curved up to the poop, loomed the form of a muscular young Negro. One foot was on the poop, the other swung up and over the rail. The muzzle of Old Smith's rifle lifted. Bert did not hear the shot, but he saw the rifle recoil and heard the man's cry as he dropped sprawling over the side of the vessel. He even thought that he heard the splash when the body struck the water. A Mexican took the Negro's place, slumped, and fell over the rail onto the poop. There was a rifle shot from somewhere forward, well above the deck, Bert thought. Von Bergen paused to clap a hand to his ear. The hand came away bloody. He wiped the blood on his shirt and fired again toward the ladder-head. Like an echo to his shot came again the crack of the unseen rifle forward. Old Smith's rifle dropped from his hands. He lurched forward against the skylight and slid to the deck in a heap. Bert jumped from behind the ventilator and sprang forward, sobbing, "I'll get you for that! I'll get you for that!" Forgotten were his scruples about killing. They had shot Old Smith. Kneeling over his partner's body, the young seaman gripped the rifle while he searched the rigging for the sharpshooter whom he knew to be there. There, high up in the main shrouds, barely visible through the space between the foot of the mizzen lower topsail and the crossjack yard below it, was a white man, leveling a rifle toward the poop, toward his own head. Choking back a sob, the boy took quick aim. Crash! The rifle dropped from the sharpshooter's hands. He slumped against the shrouds and slid from sight behind the crossjack. Old Smith was avenged. Bert saw men lunging toward him. Several attackers had reached the poop before his trigger finger had relaxed. Von Bergen swung his Luger to the left for an instant and dropped one of them. Bert sent a bullet into the leg of another and saw him crumple to the deck. Another sprang toward the skylight. The boy jerked the muzzle toward his breast and pulled the trigger. There was a click. The rifle was empty. There must be more cartridges in Old Smith's pocket, but there was no time. The man was upon him. Springing to his feet, Bert slipped his hands up to the muzzle of the gun and swung the stock with all his strength toward the black head of his assailant. The Negro fell across the body of Old Smith. Bert tried to drag him off. He must get the ammunition. He tugged at the heavy, limp body, then straightened up to club his rifle again. A quick glance to his right showed him that the attackers had gained a foothold across the width of the poop. There was a rush of feet behind him. The rest of the defenders. No more shooting. It would be a hand-to-hand fight from now on. "Come on, you yellow dogs!" Out of the corner of his eye, Bert saw the tall chief mate lift a man high over his head and hurl him head foremost over the break of the poop into the crowd below. Oblivious of the men who fought beside him, Bert swung the empty rifle again and again. A Mexican halfway over the rail fell backwards on the heads of his fellows, his knife flashing as it spun out of his hand. There were screams of rage and pain from both sides. Above the din of battle sounded the high-pitched voice of Joe Bloom. How could that be? The cook could not have been aft when the attack came. He wasn't aft. He was forward, and it was from forward that his cry came. That meant a counterattack. In the frenzied excitement of the conflict, Bert had forgotten that most of the crew were still forward. Between the surging fighting, men on the poop, he caught a glimpse of the main deck below. Under the upcurved foot of the great crossjack, he saw the advancing seamen. Pressing close behind them came the Chinese. Bert imagined that he could hear a lusty growling from the crew and the staccato inflections of excited Oriental voices. Then his momentary view was cut off by the bodies of men who came swarming over the rail. From all across the poop sounded the defiant cries of the defenders as they were forced slowly backward. Something struck Bert's left shoulder. The jar shook his whole body, but he felt no pain. By sheer weight of numbers, the defenders on the poop were driven back. Bert remembered the still form of Old Smith. He would be trampled by the advancing horde. Raising his clubbed rifle for another blow, he flashed a look behind him and saw von Bergen dragging Old Smith aft toward the chart house door. The rifle descended. A man sank under the blow and disappeared under the feet of his fellows. Then, above the hoarse imprecations and shrill curses of the men who bore down on the retreating defenders, Bert heard the bloodlust roar of the China gang on the main deck die suddenly to a surprised murmur. It rose again, still a battle cry, but now a cry tinged with fear. The attackers on the poop seemed to sense a change. Many of them looked back. Instantly, the impetuous, irresistible force of the attack ended. The foremost tween-deckers turned back, and the defenders regained a foot or two of the poop. A few tween-deckers tumbled back on top of the seething mass below. Again, Bert caught a fleeting glimpse of the main deck. Instead of a battle line, there was a frantic press of struggling men from bulwarks to bulwarks. Cries of rage, fear, and pain almost drowned out the crash of blows and the shuffle and stamp of hundreds of feet. Then a great tidal wave of tween-deckers rose flush with the poop on the heads and shoulders of those below and swarmed over the rail. Desperately, the little force of defenders swung its weapons in a futile effort to beat back the overwhelming wave. The terror of the men on the main deck, trying madly to escape the knives of the Chinese and equally deadly clubs of the seamen, communicated itself to the attackers on the poop. They advanced now with insane fear in their eyes instead of the lust of battle, and they bore the defenders steadily backward along the poop. This was not an attack. It was a rout. From the starboard side of the chart house, Bert heard the voice of Captain Hagestrom shouting a command which he could not understand. Too late, he heard the chief mate repeat it from a few steps away. "Into the chart house! Give them the poop!" Gripped by sudden fear, Bert realized that he had been left alone. Fred von Bergen was shouting his name from the chart house door, hurling his rifle at the nearest men. The boy leapt backward, turning in the air. He lit, running. A dozen of the China gang already blocked his way to the door in the after corner of the chart house. He remembered the locked doors of the wheelhouse. No help there. He would be crushed against the taffrail by the rushing horde, or swept overboard. There was just one chance. Racing aft along the rail, he turned and sprang at the steel wall of the wheelhouse, his hands reaching over his head for the rounded edge of the roof. Aided by the momentum of his leap, he drew himself half on to the top of the house. Men crashed against his legs. He kicked downward with all his might, pushing himself forward up by the force of his kicks on heads and shoulders until he was lying at full length, safe. For a minute he lay inert, gasping for breath, too exhausted to move. Then, as he started to raise himself, he glanced down through one of the helmsman's skylights and saw Einar Nelson standing quietly at the wheel. In one hand, the boatswain held a long, tapered-sounding lead. That was the only sign that he was aware of the battle or the packed bodies that darkened the windows in the forward side of the wheelhouse. On hands and knees, Bert crawled across one of the two beams that ran from the top of the wheelhouse to the top of the chart house, beams on which seamen stood when reefing or furling the spanker. Then he stood up and walked to the forward end of the chart house. Clambering over the break of the poop after the fleeing twin-deckers came the seamen, the idlers and the Chinese, with the second mate at their head. Poker Gust. Bert made a rapid mental readjustment. Poker Gust was loyal. Poker Gust was leading the counterattack that had saved the day. At the foot of the jiggermast, pursued and pursuers divided like the water on either side of a ship's cutwater. Below the watching boy, the punishment of the tween-deckers went on. It was no longer a fight. At last, the divided line of crew and Chinese fell away from the foes who could no longer fight back. Bert jumped for the spanker halyard and slid to the poop deck. Instantly, a bony hand gripped his arm. "You all right?" demanded a voice in his ear. Bert failed in an attempt to grin. Yes, I'm all right, Tuck. Are you? Good, grunted the Chinese, ignoring the question. Me tell Mr. Hargrave me keep you all light. All the time make China boys be good. Thanks, Bert answered, and pushed his way to the ladder head. Thanks, Bert answered, and pushed his way to the ladder head. Below him, perhaps 100 of the China gang cowered under the overhanging poop, held prisoners by a circling line of idlers and seamen. Disarm these men and get them below, Mr. Jensen. Keep only the badly wounded on deck. Bert was startled to see Captain Hagestrom at the foot of the steps. The inside stairs, of course. The skipper ascended to the poop, while Bert joined the men on the main deck. Under the direction of the chief mate, they formed a double line to the port door in the after-deck house. Through the lane, the tween-deckers walked, or were dragged ungently. On either side of the door grew a pile of knives, brass knuckles, and clubs, while man after man tumbled eagerly below. At the end of 10 minutes, the lane shifted to the foot of the poop steps, and the procession continued. On the poop, the line of seamen and Chinese divided at the ladder head to let the defeated mutineers pass through. One man tried to break through the lane and was knocked unconscious for his pains. The rest moved docilely through. In half an hour, not a member of the China gang who could walk remained on deck. More than a score of dead and wounded lay about the decks in grotesque postures. Across the forward end of the poop and across the main deck, where the worst of the fighting had taken place, there were slippery spots, red and ghastly. The men tramped through them indifferently, and soon the decks and the deckload were covered with hundreds of dark red footprints. Most of the Chinese shuffled forward, walking around and ignoring one of their own dead. For the second time since the voyage had begun, the captain's saloon was turned into a sick bay. This time it was filled to overflowing. On deck, Captain Hagestrom walked among the fallen, indicating to the seamen which should be carried aft and which should be laid on the planks that covered the port half of the deck load. Bert knew what that meant, sorting the quick from the dead. When the job was done, there were 9 warm corpses lying in a row. Bert looked at them dully, only half realizing that they were corpses, not living human beings. How could death be so sudden, so terrible? And old Smith, was he dead too? The boys started for the poop. Old Smith must be in the chart house where von Bergen had dragged him. All hands on the poop, said the chief mate. So, with a longing glance aft toward the chart house, Bert stopped and leaned against the jiggermast. How tired he was, and how terribly his shoulder ached. First Nick Prebinson, and now old Smith. Slowly the men assembled, seamen and idlers, and stood waiting, weary and solemn. Many were bleeding from cuts and bruises. There was the giant Oscar Sandstrom, gazing with puzzled eyes at his bloody hands. Carl Anderson, boatswain of the second's watch, binding a strip of cloth torn from his shirt around a bared and bleeding forearm. Fred von Bergen, trying to staunch the flow of blood from his right ear where the sharpshooter's bullet had clipped off its top. There was Joe Bloom, the wooden-legged cook, crying silently at sight of the gore on the big cleaver in his hand. Presently, he stepped to the rail and threw it into the gray waters. There was Sparks, smoking cigarette after cigarette in nervous haste. Dago Gus, with bloodshot eyes. The carpenter, the sour, morose baker, the steward, the 2 mess boys. Even Barney was there, caressing a short piece of 2x4 and looking around brightly at the assemblage. "Well, sir," he said to no one in particular, "I never had no hogs that was as hard to handle as them human critters." The doctor appeared, looking clean and dapper by contrast with the torn and battered crew. A little to one side stood the captain and 3 mates talking together in low tones. As they turned to join the waiting crew, Captain Hagestrom caught sight of the doctor. "Hello," said the captain, utter contempt in his voice. "Where have you been?" "Why, I've been in my stateroom, Captain. You could hardly expect the ship's doctor to—" "I expect nothing of you," the skipper interrupted in even tones, "except that you take good care of your yellow hide. There are 25 badly wounded men in the saloon. Can I expect you to get down there damned quick and look after them?" The doctor turned hastily as the white-haired skipper bore down on him and fled. Men, the captain said, you have fought bravely, and I thank you, but that is not my business with you just now. There is one of you who fought on the wrong side. I want Pete Condon. Mr. Jensen, get the irons. For a long moment there was a deathly silence. Then the men looked slowly around them, looked at each other. At last the voice called, "He ain't here, Captain." In the ensuing silence, there came from the main deck below the cryptic words of a Chinese. "You make him find toy boat. Me fix him boat. Now me fix you. You dead man come soon." A seaman looked over the rail. "My God," he cried, "the Chinks knifed him." There was a rush to the rail. The weazened old Chinese stood, a bloody knife in his hand, gazing with vindictive eyes at the body that lay at his feet. Bending over, the hatchet man wiped his knife on his victim's shirt. Then he shuffled forward on sandaled feet. Captain Hagestrom was the first to reach the side of the dying man. He tore open Pete Condon's shirt and drew it together again after one glance at the wound in his breast. "Listen, Condon," the skipper said. "You're gonna die. Tell me who paid you to lead this mutiny." The lips of the pock-marked man opened slowly. "Q," he said thickly. "Only name I know. But I wasn't leader. I took orders." His eyes wandered around the ring of faces above him as though seeking for someone who was not there. Finally, they rested on the face of the second mate. He opened his lips, but nothing came forth but red bubbles and a horrible rattle. Then his eyes stared fixedly at the dull, unrelenting sky above him. Captain Hagestrom stood up and looked at the chief mate, who stood beside him with a pair of handcuffs in his hand. "We won't need those now, Mr. Jensen," he said quietly.